This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. Respectonomics, under the heading of the Living Asset Platform, brings you this morning. I say this morning because you might be in the evening or the afternoon or late at night, wherever you might be, democratically speaking. We are bringing you this discussion on ownership. It's called Ownership Matters. This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I am your voice of Respectonomics. And Living Asset, the Living Asset series, works on the principle of the importance of the living asset, which is the human being, to which we need to ascribe all the respect and dignity that we can. That, in fact, summarizes the purpose or the goal of Respectonomics. In this instance, we're talking about ownership. And we talk about ownership mattering because we have two thoughts on this. The first is going to work around the principle of ownership personally. If we were to ask each other, who owns you? We would in fact find ourselves shuddering. We would be thinking spontaneously of things like the slave trade. We would think of some kind of civil rights, some kind of abusive process. And therefore, when we look at who owns me, it's a question that we need to be exploring. But before I do that, one thing I'd like to make clear is that the reason we're looking at this concept of ownership at a personal level is to diagnose and to assess its real importance to us as individuals, this concept of ownership, before we migrate, morph into the corporate and political avenues of ownership. So the first thing is, who owns you? And most of us would say, excuse me, nobody owns me, I own me. And when we look at this issue of who owns me, the biggest risk we run is, in fact, when we do say, I own me and nothing else does, because when we own me, that is the stepping stone to entitlement. It's the stepping stone to understanding that we have no terms of reference. We're really into it for ourselves. If we ask this issue of personal ownership, one of the greatest responses is that our ownership is defined by our legacy. We hear that line about finishing well. Well, finishing well, of course, means that there's a legacy there that is one that one can be justly proud of. So that if I ask who owns me, possibly one of the answers could be, I am owned by my legacy. With ownership comes great responsibility. Now, it is true that if I look at, or we look at, who owns me, we would in fact end up with a composite. There wouldn't be one single answer. Once we have decided that I do not own me, there's a bigger picture, then we can look at the composite. And the composite would include one's culture, parents, community, places of work, family. There could be a whole litany of places to which one would say, I owe a responsibility and I am owned by them. And that's fine. One of the greatest risks, though, is when we find ourselves being owned by something that is, in fact, unattractive. It might even be abusive. I am owned by my corporation. I am owned by my bank. I am owned by my debts. I am owned by whatever. But I'm going to make one point on this. When we in fact feel overwhelmed, when we feel that we are owned in a manner that we never really bargained for, we didn't really go, that wasn't our intent. When we experience that kind of being owned, being shackled, if you will, being in a captive situation, unattractively, when we find that, maybe we are being shackled bodily, maybe shackled mentally, but there is one part of the human being that can never be shackled, and that is, of course, one's inner being, one's character, one's soul, one's spirit. Define it as you will. But it's worth remembering that the ownership of self, also by somebody else, they do not have any say in the ownership or the direction, if you will, of your soul. Only you can do that. And that's kind of reassuring that there's always part of us that can be free of, can experience liberty from those shackles. Having looked at this question of ownership, I'm going to go one step further and also say the feeling of desolation when one feels not owned. I'm not talking here about the ownership that's unattractive, but when we feel abandoned, when we feel rejected, when we feel pushed aside, that is almost akin to nobody owns me. And that can be a very debilitating feeling. It can be one that says to us that I don't count. It's the one that creates a sort of self-silo. It's the one where we feel that we just can't crack out of the cocoon that we're in. So being owned by something isn't just necessarily a bad thing. It can be a very good thing, and it can lead to the sense of inclusiveness, the sense of that we count, the sense that our lives do matter. That's why we call this message ownership matters. It does matter who owns you and me. Now, from this is a sort of personal diagnosis. I don't think there's a one complete answer. It is worth thinking about this ownership principle. I want to say one more thing before we go to the rest of or the second part, the other railway track. And that is to understand that ownership not only comes with responsibility, it may in fact not so much be ownership as one of trust. So, for example, if we were to say that we own our nation, whatever nation that may be that you are a citizen of, if you were to say, I own this nation, this country, the better answer is that I hold it in trust for the future, for the legacy of what we are today. In other words, it's a relationship based on trust and respect, dignity, confidence, but it is not one where we can say, can say that it belongs to me and I can do what I like. We have to understand that ownership comes with responsibility. And that responsibility, I can remind you of a story many, many years ago when I got my first bicycle. And I remember so well, I was 5 years old and it was in the set in the kitchen, sort of semi-wrapped for my birthday. It was green. And I remember my mother saying, this is your bicycle and you have to take care of it. And then, of course, I got the lecture of why we need to take care of things, which, of course, makes sense. But what I really want to emphasize is with ownership comes responsibility, a responsibility for the gift or the actual blessing that we have received, but also to be able to understand that this, in the case of the bicycle, maybe it would be useful to somebody else later on. So it has that sense of continuing a gift to somebody else. Therein would lie one responsibility. Moving now then from the concept of the personal ownership, and really what I wanted to do here was more or less to explore ownership as a factor or a facet of our lives and to think about what it means to us. I don't think anyone's single answer is the single solution. I think it's more to do with very personal and very understanding of what matters to you. Ownership matters. Let's now look at the corporate and the political structure. And I want to emphasize that in the corporate structure, in the corporate structure, what I want to emphasize is that the shareholder of a corporation is the owner. The board of directors responds and is responsible to the shareholders. And I think this is possibly anecdotal, probably forensically not easy to prove. But I think that, we think, that the concept of the directors responding to the wishes of the shareholders, of the owners of the corporation, have become, let's just say, rather loose. If you think of it, we are all shareholders in one sense or another. Some very directly. You own shares in a company. You are the shareholder. You are the owner. Maybe a minority owner, maybe a very small one, maybe a microcosm of ownership, but you are still the owner. And then there's the pension plan that is the one that supplies the older generation with their pensions. That is all fully invested. By definition, linear definition, a pensioner is a shareholder. One could say one's a shareholder because as a member of the any community that has some degree of investment, some degree of putting money out, we can to be invested, we can ascribe to that the concept of ownership. And when we are owned, we expect to be treated as owners. And I believe that shareholders today are not being given that full sense of ownership. I think that we run the risk that as the shareholder is not properly respected, the risk is, of course, that the entity, the business entity, then becomes self-serving rather than serving the shareholder. This is also the case in the political orbit, where the representative feels or believes that we as the voters are actually in the way. We're inconvenient, that they know what they're doing and they don't feel fully responsive to us in terms of our needs, our preferences, and our ambitions, our goals, and so on. So when we get this division between those to whom responsibility has been given and the ownership, the rights of the shareholders need to be examined. They need to be strengthened. They need to be put in first place. Now, this may all sound very morally good, but there's in fact an underlying principle to this as well, that when the shareholder is perceived to be, shall we say, an inconvenience, when the owner doesn't receive the full rights and the full sense that the board of directors is looking after their interests, when that occurs, the greater risk then is that the cultural experience of the shareholder being pushed to the side is the same one that allows the company to perceive the cultural respect or disrespect and treating the employee, the suppliers, and the customers in the same vein. In many corporate circumstances, in many political circumstances, one feels that one is an outlier, that we don't really count, that we are not the shareholders. Well, in some cases, we're not. But when a shareholder is disabused of their responsibility, of their ambitions and interests, when that occurs, that is a culture that permeates through to both the employee as well as to the customer. When we experience, as so many people do today, inadequate service at the customer level, as in the sense that how many times do you say, well, we asked for something to be done and it wasn't done properly. It was done late. We had to go back twice. Those kinds of things. All of those can well emanate from that the corporation is not taking care of its shareholders, it's not taking care of its employees, and almost by definition, not taking care of the customer. When we add this all up, what we come back to is this. The directors of a corporation, the cabinets of governments need to be out there explaining how they are performing in the interests of their shareholders, of the people who own the rights to the organization. When that happens, there's a far greater chance then that that culture will permeate to the CEO, to the management of an organization, to the ministers that are in cabinet and so on, and give then an attitude and an impetus to build capacity with employees, build capacity with customers, build capacity with voters, but to build capacity. That is how a nation is built. It's how a country is built. It's how a company is built. It's all built on the basis of respect that allows one another to work well together. And respecting the rights of a shareholder is not something that puts the shareholder above or differently from anyone else in the organization, more though to explain to us and to them that the rights of the shareholder, the rights of the voter, the rights of the employee, the rights at whatever level need to attract the necessary dignity and respect. When we have that culture of respect, we are much more able to make decisions that can play both the long game and also can cover off incidents that are more urgently in front of us. It is a style of culture that allows us to work well together, to collaborate, collabor, to work together, and at the same time to induce a sense of loyalty and a sense of meaningfulness in our lives. This ownership does matter, and the ownership at the many levels at which it may occur, both in our personal lives, our corporate lives, our business lives, our communities, and in our political life, this concept of ownership needs to be addressed. And those of you who are in a position to influence the way in which ownership is respected, this is a clarion call to raise the flag and to let people know that they do matter. Ownership matters. I rest my case.